folks. Denise Howell here. And next up on This Week in Law, Sarah Pearson, my co-host, is here. Kathy Gellis and Michael Lissack join us. We're going to talk about some apps that are taking a very interesting approach to social problems and whether bullying and sexual assault might be in the crosshairs because of them. We're going to talk about a new Computer Fraud and Abuse Act case out of the Ninth Circuit and Ashley Madison misusing the DMCA, all next on This Week in Law.
Netcasts you love.
Really a couple of excellent guests joining us today. Michael Lissack is somebody who we've talked about on the show before because back in July, we first discussed his We Consent app that he developed. And at that point, when we thought it was so interesting that we talked about it on the show, I decided, hey, we should really reach out to him and try and get him on. So I'm so glad that we were able to do that. Michael, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
In addition to being a very interesting and innovative app developer, and we're going to talk in a few moments about various apps that Michael has put out that attempt to address social issues with technology, social problems. So we're going to get into the details of those momentarily as soon as I introduce our other guest and give you some background on both of them. Michael is the executive director of the Institute for the Study of Coherence and Emergence. He's president of the American Society for Cybernetics, ISCE professor of meaning in organizations, a visiting fellow at Hull University Business School, and an affiliate member of the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. So really quite a mouthful there and a very interesting background you've got, Michael. Right with these apps, one of which we've certainly discussed on the show before. It's called We Consent, and it attempts to address the social problem of sexual assault. So let's start there. First of all, Michael, my hat's off to you. I think it's so creative, and you've come under a lot of fire for this, but I think it's so creative to try and address social problems in a way that is current for people, a way that involves tools that they have on them all the time, like their phone, and maybe just tries, as you've said in various interviews about your app, to change the conversation at minimum that people might be having around consent. Tell us what made you come up with the We Consent app and what it does.
Okay. One thing that's very important is we should never talk about We Consent app by itself. Mm-hmm. It's part of a suite. And while We Consent allows people to record that they agree and that they say yes, it's very important to realize that there's also a No app called What About No? And everyone always has the right to change their mind. And if they do change their mind, there is an app for that as well. And so the We Consent app does not stand on its own, but is part of a suite. Now, what got me to do this?
Just to round out the suite, there's also a Changed Mind app.
That one is coming, and more important than Changed Mind, courtesy of all of the feedback, we are also working on another app that's called I've Been Violated. And should the unfortunate event occur, the statistics say that 85% of victims do not want to speak to health, school, or legal authorities right afterwards. Now, the problem with not having a conversation right afterwards is whenever that person does decide to speak up, there could be credibility questions. We could go all the way to Bill Cosby to see what that's like. But what we've done instead is with the I've Been Violated app, whenever the victim feels that he or she is in a safe place, she can reach for her phone. She records her name, a version of what happened, who did it, and then that gets encrypted and locked up, and again is only available to appropriate authorities or upon subpoena. But this way, if it's 6 months, a year, whatever the time period is, there is a piece of contemporaneous evidence that's been geocoded for location, time-stamped, and encrypted. So when you go to tell your story, there is something that was recorded within a few minutes of the event.
And that can be important for the prosecutors in a case or the triers of fact in a case, and getting evidence admitted in court that it's recorded close to when the event occurred has significance for that. Tell us about We Consent. Let's start with that one, and then we can talk about the suite of apps that go with it. What is its purpose, and what made you think to approach this via a cell phone app?
All right. So the way this started was that during Christmas week of last year, I live in Boston, and the Harvard faculty was debating fairly vigorously whether to switch to a standard of preponderance of evidence from beyond a reasonable doubt with regard to 9 sexual assault cases. And the Harvard Law School faculty was adamant that this would be a denial of due process. They did not want the university to do it. And there was about $10 million on the line. Come New Year's, money won. The Harvard Law School faculty did not win, and Harvard adopted the preponderance of evidence standard. This was a lot of press in Boston. And I'm reading this from my background, and I'm saying, there's got to be a better way. If you want to do something that requires a demonstration that there has been consent, you need something more than just he said, she said. And what's the first thing that I thought of is, what is it that every college student has within 2 or 3 feet of them at almost all times? Their cell phone. So that meant that at least to me, it seemed obvious to do an app that indicated a mutual yes. And as I said a minute ago, you can't have an app that indicates yes unless you also have an app that allows somebody to indicate no if or when they change their mind.
Mm-hmm. We got a question in IRC on the question of separating those functions. Why did you decide to have a separate app for indicating a lack of consent?
Well, first off, the apps can be on different partners' phones. It's important that the no app be on the phone of the person who wants to say no. The yes app could be a phone of either person. The second thing is that, at least it's been my experience, that apps work best when they are single purpose, very easy to use, and very clear. So each of the apps in our suite does one thing and only one thing. And then if you hit the button for that app, you know what it is you're hitting the button for.
Got it. Okay. So I think we have some video of how the We Consent app works to give people a better idea of what we're talking about.
Say the name of the person with whom you want to have sexual relations.
Derek.
Partner, say your name.
Derek.
Allison.
Would like to have sexual relations with you. Do you consent? Say yes or no.
Yes.
Consent confirmed. Have fun.
Love to have fun at the end. Although as sultry sounding as the lady's voice is on the app, one could see, especially in the context of that video, I think, where they're standing outdoors and it takes a while to get everything configured properly for the video to capture both people involved. It kind of grinds things to a halt. And maybe that's not a bad thing. What's your take on that, Michael?
Well, I'm going to give you 2 perspectives on it. One, it's a good thing because, the main purpose is the running of the app, but the evoking of a conversation about what it is that the 2 people are about to do. So if you need to have a discussion about whether or not or how to run the app, that all by itself is a prelude to a discussion about the sexual encounter that they're planning. The second rejoinder to that has to do with something that reflects my age. When I was their age, condom manufacturers had not yet figured out that they were supposed to put perforations in the wrappers. So we all had a very awkward 2 or 3 minutes while we had to deal with getting it unwrapped, et cetera. And if we could survive that 2 or 3 minute interlude, I think young people today can survive the 18 to 20 seconds that this takes.
So this is so interesting on any number of levels, and has, as I mentioned, drawn a lot of fire your way from folks who think that, gee, as creative as this isn't how we should be addressing sexual assault. It's certainly not going to solve the problem. That doesn't tend to make me have a negative opinion of it. The notion that there are other things you can do to solve sexual assault. It certainly seems like this is a useful tool. It could be a way to start a dialogue between people, between peers, between administrators and students that might not otherwise happen. So, you're not going to get a whole lot of criticism from me. We'll see what Kathy and Sarah think about this, because I think that, as many ways as we can tackle a problem is a good thing. But one thing that comes up over and over again in the criticism that you've received since the app's launched is the notion that consent is not a one-time thing, that it has to be continuous and it could be withheld at any time during the proceedings and turn what was a consensual encounter into a non-consensual one. And that the app doesn't really take that into account. And
to which
go ahead.
To which my normal reply is, if you only look at one app, you're absolutely right. But that's why there's two apps. I mean, the people that talk about this tend to want to downplay the fact that there's another app. It is also highly likely that the Yes app is going to be on one party's phone and the No app may be on the other party's phone. The reality is, if you want to say no, and if there's no physical coercion involved, I mean, because obviously everything is different if you're being threatened with a baseball bat. But if there's no physical coercion involved and you want to say no, you want to stop. And if you want to stop, you are going to do such things as get up. Reaching for your phone is not that unusual. Deciding that you have the ability, courtesy of the What About No app, to summon a policeman, I mean, that's fairly powerful. It's a virtual policeman. It's not a real policeman. No one's going to come knocking on the door. But nonetheless, policeman is there on your phone and can be summoned in half a second. When people say consent is continuous, of course it is. And if you withdraw it, you withdraw it. But what they're leaving out is that we are in a context where the standard has become, or is shifting to, only yes means yes. And in that standard, how is it that you demonstrate that both people actually consented? Leaving things that he said, she said is not working. And no one has yet come up with a better way.
Yes, the only way to document in a video form that consent was ongoing would be to have the phone make a sex tape, which I don't think anybody would want to have happen for this purpose. Maybe for other purposes, but not for this purpose. So that is definitely a problem in your no app response might be a good one, because the only other alternative is to document the entire proceedings, and I don't think that's going to work for anybody. One reason why that wouldn't work for anybody, and one other potential problem with having all this video recorded, is you're very quick to emphasize the security and the encryption that's put on videos, but particularly, I mean, in the wake of last week's show's Ashley Madison discussions and whatever the hack of the week might be, it seems to be trivially easy to get at protected information and make it public, even when it's information that was never supposed to get that way. Do you want to talk about the steps that you're taking to make sure that could not happen?
The only way you could make it happen would be to steal the offline servers. So yes, information is picked up and transmitted via the cloud, but we sweep it every 5 to 10 minutes and it's no longer available online. So yeah, if you went in and stole the hard drives, you could get it. But I'm relying on the idea that both Amazon and Google, whose offline services we use, have fairly decent physical security to keep from walking in and stealing their physical equipment. If you try to get it online, both of those services trigger a large number of alerts to the people whose data that it is and don't deliver it for 5 or 6 hours. So you could make the request as a hacker. It still is going to take 5 or 6 hours, at which point we're going to know and put a stop to it. So shy of stealing the physical drives, the only data that's really available is 5 or 10 minutes worth. And yes, somebody, I suppose, could go in and steal that. I can't imagine with everything else that's out there to be stolen that finding 2 people's names who merely say yes is really great data, but you never know.
Right. So those recordings that are made by all the apps, they are not accessible to the users at all, whether you're using the Yes app or the No app. Is that right?
They are not available to the user unless the user has gone to a judge and obtained a subpoena.
Got it. Sarah, what do you think about the whole notion of video app consent?
I'm actually quite skeptical. I think there are a couple articles that in the show notes about this concept of kind of ongoing consent, and that really resonated to me because it feels like this app would be more useful for proving yes than it would for actually somebody proving no. Just because you might, it just seems so easy to imagine the situation where they do the initial yes videos and then things, transition and, one of them changes their mind and they don't have a video record of that, but they have the yes video and that can be used against the person in a really negative way. To me, that seems like more of a higher possibility.
Sarah,
yeah.
I interrupt and ask you, why is it that you think that they would not run the No app? I mean, it's not like they want to continue doing whatever it is they're physically doing with one another. The person has made a decision to stop. Why would he or she go reaching for the phone, which is going to be within 2 or 3 feet? We are talking about college people. The stats say 7% of them even sleep with their hand. 14% sleep with it under their pillow. 83% never let it shut off except when it reboots. Why? Yeah. I mean, yes, if it was me and it was someone my age, where I would have to go down to the kitchen to go get the phone, that's a completely different issue. But college kids have a phone within 2 feet.
Sorry, but if it's the case that they can reach for their phone and make the video, it seems like, and the person is going to let them stop and get out of it, then that would be just as easy as that person saying no. All they have to say is, hey, I'm not comfortable with it anymore, and it's over, and they don't need any sort of evidence. So it seems like it's hard to imagine.
It's not about evidence. It's not about evidence. It is about changing the way people have discussions. And you may think that both parties are rational and calm and doing things the right way. And it would be great if that was the case 99% of the time. I don't think it is. And sometimes you need an extra tool. You need an extra prop in order to get the idea across. If the one party is saying, I bought you dinner, you owe me. I'm not going to take you home. You owe me. It's really cold outside. You don't want to have to walk home. You owe me. This gives them another tool to play back, to add into, if you like, the psychological combat that may ensue once somebody decides to change their mind. And to just assert that everybody's going to yield when somebody says no, it's great. It would be marvelous, but it's naive.
No, I am definitely not saying that everyone's going to yield, but I'm going to say that the people who are going to let the woman go find the phone, take it out and say, make her no video are the same people that are going to stop when you say no. I guess I'm having a hard time kind of seeing when it's going to come up.
I have a hard time accepting that premise. I'm sorry. That's just not been my observation or understanding of the college students today. You are immediately jumping from bad behavior to good behavior, and I don't think that's the way this works.
So have you actually...
Go ahead, Kathy.
Have you actually tested this? Is there any user testing? I mean, you're making some assumptions, and there are assumptions that you've got some data to suggest are reasonable starting assumptions. But what is the user testing of relationships where encounters have been successful, either in terms of yes and yes or yes and no, where the parties are of accord? Is there any usability testing when it has turned into a he said, she said, where a consent was withdrawn and it was not respected? And have you seen this app actually being used in those environments? It feels like there's two sides of what you're saying it would be useful for, one of which initially was an evidentiary one where it can help document that consent had been withdrawn. And I think there might be some concerns there, both in terms of, is it actually usable evidence of that, given the timing of, can we assume from whatever no gets recorded that it was an effective no that had been communicated? And also whether, as Sarah points out, whether it's realistic for somebody who doesn't.
I have to interrupt you for a moment.
Okay.
The no, is recorded because when you communicate the no, you are making a video of the other person watching the no.
Okay.
It would be very hard for that person to indicate that they did not get it because you have a video of them watching the no.
Okay. I think Sarah's concern, okay, that's interesting that there's the two people and you would do it. But Sarah's concern is also, are people really keeping their devices this close in this type of situation on a reliable enough basis for this community? Do we have actual data to suggest that, yes, in fact, there is, and that people will have these types of encounters with these sorts of devices nearby where they can be relied on to be a tool for this encounter? We are making presumptions, and I hear your data that they may not be generationally, they may be somewhat plausible assumptions, but is there any data to suggest that as these relationships are truly unfolding, that that these devices are being used?
To which my reply is, as the usage occurs, the data will get generated. This is a major social change. We are asking people to go from a standard of no means no to only yes means yes. The important thing in all of this is the affirmative consent standard demands that the young people engage in a discussion first. The purpose of these apps is as a prop and as a tool to evoke those discussions. The legal stuff, the evidence stuff is all secondary. That is not the main purpose at all. If it needs to be used for that, fine. But that is not what the apps are about. The apps are about tools to change the context, to evoke or provoke discussion. And if two people have a discussion about whether or not to run the app and decide not to run the app, by me, that's a major success. It has nothing to do with needing the app to be run. It has everything to do with getting them to talk to each other first, before they do whatever it is they're going to do.
Yeah, I think that goes along with the point that's made in the NPR article and piece that included discussion of we consent and various other things that college campuses are doing to try and address this problem on campus, and the bringing in the bystander training program that's discussed there. There's a little back and forth about giving some scenarios to people, and the example they give is that there's a girl who's really drunk and she's being taken home by a guy who's told you that he would like them to get together. What do you do? What do you do to intervene? This looks like it could be a dangerous situation. And some folks jumped in and said, well, I'd try and accompany them home and make sure everything was okay. But the trainer said, you really got to think more like a kid and think more about just sort of putting the brakes on to the situation. Maybe you just go over and ask the couple if they want to go for pizza. Maybe you back up against a light switch and accidentally on purpose flip it on. Anything that just sort of has a break in the action and makes people consider what they're doing. And I think that this app could, definitely serve that purpose as well. I have a hard time thinking practically first, that a lot of young people would have it on their phones unless they were required to. And I know that you're making some overtures that might make that a reality, Michael, by talking to sports teams and their coaches and college administrators and trying to get it adopted on more of an institutional level. So that might be helpful. But I personally just am skeptical that young people would think, hey, this is fun. I think I'll put this on my phone. Well,
Denise, I think okay, now we will switch to where there is a law thing, which is the impact of being falsely accused is devastating. Mm-hmm. And to suggest that there are not at least several million college males who are worried about that is also naive.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely.
The cases
I'm the
that
mother
have occurred
of a young
have been
man, so
horrible.
this is near and dear to my heart.
I mean, the cases that have occurred have been simply horrible. Mm-hmm. And to suggest that the male may not want this on their phone, then the male may want it on their phone not because it's fun, but because they think that by at least triggering the conversation, they have a much better idea of what it is they're getting themselves into. And again, the purpose is much better served if the two parties just have the discussion about what they're going to do and never run the app. Mm-hmm. But you need the prop in order to cause the conversation to occur.
Yep, I get what you're saying. Sarah, do you have any final thoughts on this before we move on?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I guess I obviously I'm skeptical. I think, if it's really just a tool to prompt the conversation, I think that is healthy and good. And obviously the more talking they do, the better. But I'm uncomfortable with the evidentiary aspect of it. I really think that could actually have negative implications. And so I worry about that aspect of it. But in terms of prompting a discussion and that sort of thing, it's hard to argue with that. So.
Kathy, the other aspect of this that fascinates me is this whole notion of, this is not a contract or not an enforceable civil contract in any way that the law would recognize. But the notion of having technology be the vehicle by which an agreement is set forth, I think is pretty new and interesting and is happening on all kinds of fronts. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, there's a temptation, I think, when I first read about this to say I could understand how the word icky got thrown around, with the idea that you would have technology intermediating a very, very primal human relationship. And is that really the path that we want humanity to develop around? And maybe there's some costs, even if this app is absolutely perfect for all intended purposes. Is that a good thing? I'd actually rather have a more neutral view towards the technology, where it's kind of neutral itself. It's not necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think what Michael's suggesting is it is a changing thing, and that change can be good and change can be bad. But I think there might be, as we sort of figure out how we want technology in general to start interacting with how we've understood life to unfold, it sort of, I think, needs to unfold a little bit organically. And the one thing I bristled at, I share Sarah's concerns about the app overall and the evidentiary issues. But the one thing which we just brushed on was the idea that it might be required. And I think when you start prescribing technology as a solution for human problems, especially when it's sort of reflexively, we know we have a problem. And I don't think any of us are disagreeing that there are issues with how these relationships are unfolding and the communication and the consent that's happening around them. But is just adding technology the right way to go down, or are we accidentally potentially creating more problems? And I think when I'm hearing language about it being required, I'm starting to react to it negatively, because I think people should have full range of discretion over the technology tools they choose to use or not use.
So can you speak to that, Michael? Can you tell us what success you've had, if any, of having this sort of more institutionally adopted?
Well, institutionally adopted does not necessarily mean required. Mm-hmm. We're in discussions with about 300 colleges and universities about having them make it available campus-wide or system-wide. But making available is not the same as requiring. The only people that we're aware of that have chosen to go the required route are some sports teams. Mm-hmm. And quite bluntly, given some of the press that has gone on around sports teams, I'm not sure that there's a problem with telling people who are on scholarship and are in effect getting paid to behave in a certain manner that there's one more requirement that they have to fulfill when there's a history amongst that segment of the population for bad things to happen.
Yeah, I understand that argument. It's actually one that in other contexts I find rather troubling. I'm thinking in particular about social media policies for what scholarship athletes can do. And some of this is private university, but many of it's public university. And the idea, there's a lot of instances where athletes are essentially being forced to negotiate away their general First Amendment rights in exchange for their scholarship. And I find those troubling. So I would extend those concerns even to this environment where I, have it available as an option. Fine. Maybe even we go down the social, the path of, is there enough social pressure where even if it's not technically obligatory, it becomes sort of de facto obligatory. I'd have to think that through. But when it's truly sort of an official condition, I think there's general First Amendment rights in terms of how people use their technology. And so when technology is forced down people's throats, I think that creates some very significant issues, no matter how well-intentioned that requirement actually is.
And Kathy, I'm going to reply to you with, just because they require that you install it on your phone does not mean that anyone's ever been required to use it.
Okay,
so
fair
again,
enough.
All that's being required is that you have prop. It's there to be talked about, which again is the main purpose of the apps. So the requirement that's been imposed by the schools that have imposed it on their sports teams is you must have this on your phone. The athlete knows it's on his or her phone. What they do after that remains their business. They are required to have the prop. You cannot buy a car in the United States that does not come with seatbelts.
I think
the law says you're supposed to use them, but there's nothing that's actually going to force you to.
I still think there's significant concerns towards the liberty interest of the student to be required to install any particular software on any particular device they choose to own. I can understand all the arguments for why we might think this is a good thing in this particular instance, but I think it's something that on a macro level we need to take a step back and think very seriously about before we start having that conversation about any sort of software or any sort of app. I don't think
Kathy, the technology person in me is going to say most colleges are going to some form of hybrid online learning, and the only way you can partake in the online part is to make use of the software suite that the college wishes you to. So they already are faced with a requirement of having software that they must somehow access if they wish to get that portion of their education.
It doesn't obviate the concerns, though. It doesn't obviate any of the concerns, and in those contexts, the colleges could potentially offer school-provided equipment. In my day, we had computer labs. Maybe nobody wants to use that, but there are ways of dealing or open technologies where if it's web browser based, people tend to have web browsers. There's not really as forced a requirement to be able to interact with any particular content driving the particular device that the person owns. So the fact that, and I wouldn't take too much out of the fact that we may see people already cruising past these concerns as evidence that the concerns aren't valid. It's sort of more reason for alarm to suggest that maybe we need to take a step back and look at all the instances where people are requiring students to have specific software on specific devices. I think that's problematic for the general liberty interest that implicates.
Sure. And you could see that happening in any number of contexts. Just sticking with sports teams for a moment, maybe there's an app that's required to analyze strategies or plays or what have you. That's a tool that the whole team is using and everyone's required to have. But maybe it also has some sort of nefarious information gathering technology that the students don't have any control over. And that would be a concern. I could definitely see that, in any number. You have to be careful if you're going to be an academic institution requiring students to use particular programs or technologies, that they are completely above board with how they're handling information and data and everything else. But I don't know that I'm ready to say that there can't be a requirement. If you're taking a course, you need to access a particular thing, you have to use a particular tool. I think that's up to the school and the professor, and the students, if they don't like it, can get their education probably somewhere else. But I can understand it's a concern. Maybe it's a concern that should be put on the institution itself to make sure that
we consent suite of apps. You must go through protect=respect.com because Apple banned them from the App Store. So the only way that you can get them is by getting them directly from us. But it's not a problem. It's just one extra click. When you join ICE, which is the Institute for the Study of Coherence and Emergence, as a student member, you get the apps. You get it's your own store that has the apps in them. It's one extra step, but it's all of about an extra 60 or 75 seconds.
All right. Thanks for that. We're getting lots of people in IRC are very interested in the bullying issue, are giving us all kinds of good comments and insights. One is, of course, bullying is not limited to the school environment. Yes, of course, it's not. Can happen anywhere. And with all our kids and so many after school and extracurricular activities, it could really honestly happen during any aspect of their life. So as much trouble as we might have defining what is bullying and what's not, certainly kids know when they feel intimidated and hurt. So as parents, it's something that's much on our minds, and always interested in creative solutions to the problem.